All right, fantastic. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today and to talk about this topic. So Asif did a really great introduction, so I don't have a lot to add, but let me tell you just a little bit more about myself. So as Asif mentioned, I'm an enterprise librarian and collaboration evangelist. So I really help organizations, really large organizations, build effective governance plans, drive user adoption, and ultimately create this idea of community engagement for collaboration tools like SharePoint and Office 365. As you can see here, I'm a co-author for Ruben Gatz's book, Practical SharePoint 2010 Information Architecture. If you're interested in topics related to ROI, check out that book. I'm also an organizer for SharePoint Saturday Twin Cities. I have to put a plug in for that, Asif, that our next event is coming up on October 28th here in the Twin Cities. So if you're interested, don't hesitate to reach out to me. My blog is here. You can reach me on Twitter. I even gave everyone my email, so you can feel free to reach out to me and ask me any questions that you like. My areas of focus and interest definitely on the ROI or the business valuation of these collaboration tool sets and enterprise level governance. I do a fair bit of that as well, but user adoption is my very favorite thing to talk about, which is why I'm happy to be here today, getting to talk to all of you. So let's go ahead and jump in. For many of us, the challenge of driving effective SharePoint user adoption can feel insurmountable. We start out with good intentions, but inevitably the path to SharePoint nirvana gets interrupted, and we're left with a muddle of SharePoint sites, unclear business expectations, ineffective training, and ultimately a lack of true business engagement. So during the webinar today, we're going to break down the key types of SharePoint and Office 365 users that you have in your organization and share some practical tips on how you can engage, channel, and redirect those users where necessary to drive successful adoption. So that's our mission. But before we get to that, I think we need to recognize that driving user adoption can be a very arduous process. So while your plan might look very straightforward, the reality of user adoption, we're going to have some swamps that we're going to have to go through, and we're going to have steep hills to climb. We're going to get wet. It's going to get windy, and things are going to be definitely a little arduous on our path. And it's perfectly acceptable and okay if this is not your first attempt to drive user adoption of SharePoint and Office 365. I've worked for a variety of companies where we had a turnaround strategy or a turnaround plan from a wild, wild west implementation of SharePoint to a well-governed and an inspiring user adoption story that really helped the users to be able to see that vision and to be able to move forward successfully in their adoption of the platform. So no matter where you're coming from, either just starting out or you're really trying to refine your approach because it's not getting you the results that you were hoping for, either way, the content in this webinar will help you get to where you need to go. The fundamental truth that I think we all need to acknowledge before we get started is that adoption isn't something that can be mandated. Adoption occurs only when users decide for themselves that the solution provides them with a net benefit. And this is where it's really about the giving away the power. And once we acknowledge that we can't make anyone adopt the platform, we have to hopefully paint a picture so that they can see what the platform can do for them. Only at that point will they actually strive to adopt it. This also automatically counteracts any theory about if we name it correctly, if we don't call it SharePoint and we call it something else, or if we train people on the features, they'll adopt it. This really nullifies all of those myths to really say we have to make it relevant to them. We have to make it something that they want to buy into. So that's the introduction. So let's go ahead and jump right in to our cast of characters. And this is the cast of characters for the user adoption story that's occurring at your organization today. These 6 characters are not meant to represent all of the types of SharePoint and Office 365 users that you have in your company, but there's 6 of the types of users that you have, and these 6 are the ones that we're going to really focus on today. And we're going to talk about what you need to know about these characters and really which ones, how to leverage, how to guide, and how to promote some of these users to be able to help you with your user adoption plans. So we're going to start out by defining each character. Then we're going to go through and take a look at some user adoption theories, some motivational theory, and we'll kind of circle back as we talk about those things into how these characters relate and then how we can work with them. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in, and we're going to start talking about the first of our cast of characters. and that is the scariest of creatures, I like to say. It's the intelligent, opinionated, and immovable SharePoint naysayer. The naysayers tend to exist at all levels of the organization, and they persist in deriding SharePoint without provocation or apology. They may be Microsoft haters. They could be developers, information hoarders with their special 3-ring binders that are super secret, or they could just be tech geeks who are really above tools like SharePoint and Office 365. Many of you no doubt have seen those types of users in your organization. So the great things, and there are some great things about naysayers, they tend to be highly intelligent, highly influential, and they're often seen as the opinion leaders or experts within your organization. The negatives about naysayers is that they're hard to influence. They have a tendency to know the right answer, even if they don't know the right answer. They think that they do. And they tend to be very entrenched in their beliefs, and unfortunately, those beliefs are not helping us right out of the gate when it comes to SharePoint. So that's an introduction to the naysayer. As I mentioned, we're going to introduce all 6 characters, and then we're going to loop back and talk about them more as we continue through the webinar. So the next character we're going to talk to is the SharePoint enthusiasts. I love enthusiasts. They're the excitable people that are prepared to hurdle over any and all obstacles in their attempt to win people over to SharePoint. Enthusiasts exist at all levels of the organization. They could be SharePoint users, site administrators, site collection admins, or even SharePoint staff in IT. The bonuses of, or the pros for enthusiasts is that they're passionate, they're highly engaged, they love the platform, and that's infectious, that positivity and that goodwill towards SharePoint and wanting other people to succeed with it. And that passion is incredible if we can tap into it. Their willingness to work hard and learn new things, they have really a desire to succeed. The cons to your enthusiasts, and I say this, and I'm an enthusiast for SharePoint, but sometimes we enthusiasts can come off a little like overexcited teenagers. So sometimes it's a really good idea to just temper the enthusiasm just a little bit, so that the people that we're trying to influence can come along with us on that journey. In addition, sometimes enthusiasts really try too hard to earn the approval of the naysayers. We're going to come back to that theory later, but I see people wrapping themselves firmly around the axle on trying to convert naysayers and burning themselves out in the process. All right, so let's move on to our next character, which is the cowboy. Cowboys jump in feet first. They're quick to declare, I don't need any training, this stuff is easy, or I've been doing this kind of work forever, just give me admin rights and I'll be fine. The pros to our cowboys, they're self-starters. They're really willing to research things independently. They're highly creative. If you need to figure out a new component within Office 365, for example, Forms, which is a new component, and you need somebody who can cover a lot of ground quickly, go in and figure out how it works, a cowboy is going to do a great job of that for you. Self-guided, undirected, just learning at a very rapid pace. The cons of cowboys is that they tend to jump in feet first. They ride roughshod over best practices or sometimes ignore them altogether. And they like to customize at will, otherwise known as customize the hell out of everything, without really any thought to the consequences. So for example, back in the day when we had InfoPath, being able to take and customize every list that you have into a custom InfoPath form with custom code, and then they leave their role or they leave the company and suddenly we don't know how to support what it is that they left behind. That can be a real negative with the cowboys. All right, moving on to our 4th character, we're going to talk about ninjas. Ninjas are your elite group of internal SharePoint influencers, leaders, and teachers. You can consider them to be your SharePoint internal MVPs or the Yoda-like people in your organization that really deliver success. Ninjas can exist at all levels of the org. They're passionate about leveraging SharePoint to drive business value. They build solutions, but more than that, they're willing to share what they know with others. And really, from a white hat perspective, they're geared towards educating about best practices, about why you should do some things, why you shouldn't overly customize unless that's actually necessary. So your ninjas are going to have more of an understanding of not only the technical facets of the tools themselves, but why you should make one choice rather than another in terms of how you implement it. The pros, of course, to our ninjas is that they're very knowledgeable. They clearly understand the value that SharePoint and Office 365 bring. They're key influencers for others in the organization, and they know why we should do things a certain way, why we should follow these best practices. The cons of the ninjas, they're a very rare gem to find. Your true ninjas require not only a lot of technical knowledge, but they require a certain level of adeptness at figuring out best practices. It might be harder to find ninjas in your organization, or in some cases, you actually might need to go out and find consulting resources that can serve as ninjas. The most compelling ninjas that I found, and I found them at every organization that I've been at, are really self-taught and having an awareness of best practices based on their learnings of the system and a desire to optimize and educate. All right, so moving on to our fifth character. This is probably a word that most of you haven't heard before. It's called a Tumbler. Tumbler is a Yiddish word that means to move about. Traditionally, the word was used to describe comic entertainers or social directors. Consider them to be the cruise directors if you're taking an upcoming cruise vacation. Tumblers are responsible for getting people engaged, ensuring they're fully committed and excited about SharePoint. They're the ones that make SharePoint cool, hip, and fun in your organization. They're the ones that are really the head of the party, the head of the user group, the people that bring other people in to the tribe of SharePoint in your organization. Tumblers are passionate, they're engaged, they're energetic, they help spread the message and get others interested in trying out the platform. The cons, Tumblers tend to be built for quick engagement and to start the conversations. Oftentimes, Tumblers might not be the nitty-gritty detail people that you want teaching people everything there is to know about how to build something in Power Apps and Flow. But your Tumbler could start that conversation for you, help drive people to that conversation, and then hand it off to a ninja who can then talk to you about the details and the best practices of why. All right, and then the sixth of our characters is the Straggler. The Straggler is, of course, your technology laggards. These are the last people that are still trying to cling to the protected shelter of your shared drives. If they do decide that they're going to tip a toe into the SharePoint waters, don't expect them to do more than the basics, uploading files, creating folders, things like that. They'll be heavily resistant to learning new features, for example, communication sites, lists, wikis, and how to engage with those. The Stragglers tend to be traditional. They need a strong reason to consider making a change. And that strong reason needs to be something that resonates inside of them or needs to be something fun that engages them. So it's going to be a little bit harder to get them on board. They approach innovation with a high degree of skepticism, at times almost seeming to have an aversion to change. All right, so that summarizes our 6 characters. It is important to recognize that many of us can wear multiple hats and may represent multiple characters. I can tell you that I definitely align with I'm an enthusiast, I'm a ninja, and I'm a tumbler, and that's okay. At any point in time, I might choose to focus on a different one of those characters based on the need, based on the meeting that I am. Some people really fit into one character very well. I've met a lot of people that are Cowboys. I've even met a few that are Naysayers, and we've had some fantastic conversations. So it's okay if you fit into one. It's okay if you kind of bridge between a couple of different categories. But ultimately, you're going to need to determine for your organization which character best describes you and which other characters that you're going to need to surround yourself with in order to support the user adoption programs that you want to implement. So I want to pause there, Asif, to see if we have any questions before we move forward, now that we've started the discussion and the introduction of the characters.
No
I don't see any yet, so I'm going to just give it a couple of seconds here, see if we have any questions about the characters. I don't see anything, so let's go ahead and keep on moving then. Okay. All right. So now that we've met our characters and we know how they can help and hurt our chances of driving user adoption success, we're going to take a deeper dive into some of the fundamental principles of user adoption and talk about how users actually adopt new ideas. So to start that off, we're going to take a look at Everett Rogers' classic diffusion model, which illustrates how new ideas and new technologies move through population groups. So if you look at the model, the bell curve, we always start off with the innovators are the first people that want to try and adopt something. That's the 2.5% of the population that camps out outside of Best Buy for a week in order to get the newest iPhone when it comes out, or they pre-ordered the Galaxy Note 8. I think that that's the new one that came out, a month ahead of time because they want to have the very first batch that ships out, right? The innovators, we don't have to try and get involved. They're automatically going to be there because they have to feel first. They feel compelled to be first out of the gate. Next, we've got the early adopters, which is 13.5% of the population. The early adopters, some of them are inspired by the innovators to start adopting, but early adopters themselves kind of have a flair for trying out things that are new. They don't have to be on the absolute bleeding edge, but they want to be on the cutting edge of things that are new. Then we move into the early majority, which is 34% of the population, the late majority at 34%, and then the last 16% is the laggards. So what's interesting about user adoption is when we look at this bell curve, and we're talking about SharePoint and Office 365, in order to drive effective user adoption at your organization, you have to get through the innovators, through all the early adopters, and about 45 to 55% of the way into your early majority, which will put you just shy of the tippy top of our bell curve. If you can manage to get that level of people engaged and adopted to SharePoint and Office 365 in your organization, you're going to jettison yourself over the top of the bell curve and down the backside of the bell curve with no problem. So really what we're trying to get to is through that early adopters and through half of that early majority. Now, what's standing in our way is this idea of the chasm that you can see there. And Jeffrey Moore proposed an addendum to this Everett Rogers classic diffusion model by saying that chasm is the big problem because it's the ability for the early adopters to get the early majority excited about adopting any new platform. That's where things go to die. So you really have to jump the shark or jump the chasm in terms of driving enough interest in SharePoint and Office 365 to be able to get enough of those early majority people invested in the platform so that way you can successfully clear that chasm. At every organization that I've been at, my user adoption campaigns are targeted at those early adopters and jumping that chasm to get to the early majority. So that should really be the sweet spot that we're targeting for what we want to do with our user adoption programs. And in order to jump that chasm and infect our early majority, we really need to drive what Malcolm Gladwell called a tipping point. And a tipping point is the crucial moment when a chain reaction reaches critical mass. It's this idea of a single idea circumnavigates the globe, and we go from having somebody who appeared on America's Got Talent, and suddenly their video gets posted and it has 18 million views in 24 hours or 2 days, right? That's a tipping point. It's an absolute immense scale of very fast adoption and knowledge. And if we can get SharePoint user adoption to reach a tipping point in our organizations where it's not just we as the SharePoint people are talking about user adoption, but it's the users themselves that are spreading it to others, that tipping point is going to be able to help us really win the day with that early majority. All right, so what we're going to look at in order to help us reach that tipping point is something called the key agents of change. And if any of you have read The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell, you're going to, some of these are going to ring fairly true for you. There are more than 2 key agents of change, but in the interest of time for our webinar today, we're going to really focus just on 2 to start with. And the 2 we're going to look at are the law of the few and the power of context. So let's go ahead and talk about the law of the few. In 1906, there was an Italian economist named Vilfredo Pareto who made 2 really interesting observations. He noted that 80% of the land in Italy was owned by only 20% of the population. He also noted that 20% of the pea pods in his garden contained 80% of his peas. He didn't believe those events were coincidental, and years after he died, other economists agreed, and they dubbed it the 80-20 rule or the Pareto principle. So how does the Pareto principle apply to SharePoint? It really predicts behavior patterns of our users. You can use the principle to estimate that 80% of your SharePoint site traffic comes from 20% of your users, and 80% of your content is uploaded by about 20% of your users. So put simply, the law of the few really suggests that a few of your users account for the vast majority of your SharePoint success. And that's good for us because we don't have to reach the 80%. If we effectively target 20%, we'll be able to drive 80% of our change. Now, the bad news is an even smaller percentage of that 20% of users have the ability to start a movement and help us reach that tipping point that we need to. So it can't just be any of the 20%. There are specific factions within that 20% that we really need to target in order to drive the kind of tipping point change that we need. So you're going to have to figure out how to recruit a special group of people in your organization. That is this law of the few. So let's take a look at who those individuals are going to be. So first, you need connectors. Connectors are early adopters. They embrace ideas and cultural elements and really serve as translators or idea emissaries. Their recommendations are powerful in that they impact others positively. They compel others to really sit up and take notice. Now remember back to our classic diffusion model from Everett Rogers, your connectors are going to be key in helping, they're going to be part of your early majority and they're going to help you jump that chasm. Or sorry, they're going to be part of your early adopters and they're going to help you jump that chasm into your early majority. Connectors can literally pick up an idea and transmit it to others. You can call them almost an agent of infection for their ability to do so. So obviously I put some pictures up here of people that I think of as being connectors. The important thing is going to be for you and your organizations to figure out who those connected people are to be able to drive that change. Connectors don't have to be famous, but they have to be well networked within your organization. They tend to be very friendly. They tend to have a high degree of, they're either gregarious or they're very interconnected, have tight relationships across the organization. They know everyone and they seem to have always an uncanny ability to be in the center of wherever the action is. Those are the people that you're really looking for to be your connectors. Now, this connector concept is key for the law of the few, but we've got to tie that back into the 6 characters that we started talking about at the beginning of the webinar. So these connectors, the way that I'd leverage them in terms of the characters that we've been talking about is I'd leverage these connectors to be some of our tumblers. Remember that our tumblers are our social people that help bring people into the SharePoint party, help keep it going, keep it engaging, keep it dynamic. If you think about that, that dovetails really nicely into what we're talking about with these connectors. They're people who are well networked. They're people who bring influence. They also bring fun in a sense of a dynamic sense to the conversations that they had. So you're going to need those people to help drive interest to SharePoint and foster the community and keep people coming into your pipeline. All right, so the law of the few, we need connectors, and we're going to turn them into our tumblers. We also need mavens. Mavens are accumulators of knowledge. They're enthusiasts that need a constant influx of new ideas. And they not only learn things at an incredibly rapid pace, but they aren't satisfied with just knowing something. They feel compelled to share what they know and educate others about it. Their enthusiasm for knowledge, their willingness to give of their time, and their talent really makes mavens important allies in your user adoption story. So you can almost sum this up by saying that mavens are the knowledge sharers and connectors are the social glue that are going to bring people together in your organization. So I've given a couple of examples here of people that I would consider to be mavens. You've got Leonardo da Vinci and Galileo. The important thing for you is going to be finding similar people who are driven to learn and driven to educate and share what they know with others for the common good. And if we're going to relate that theory back to our 6 characters that we started off with, this idea of mavens translates most nicely into our ninjas. I'm going to be talking about it later on in this presentation, but at one of my former companies, we actually built a formal program around our ninjas. We call them SharePoint Ninjas. And that program recognized the pivotal role that these influencers played in our organization and in the adoption of our tools. And I'll give you a little bit more information about how that Ninja program worked and link you off to where you can find even more information. But we really lauded our ninjas as public examples of SharePoint success. We gave them Ninja swag, we built a program for their growth, and even an official HR recognition and mentorship program. So we'll talk about that more in just a little bit. But I think it's important to point out that the law of the few does not just apply to the good guys of the tumblers and the ninjas. The law of the few can actually speak as well to the naysayers, right? Because a few well-spoken, well-positioned naysayers who are intractable in their negative criticism of SharePoint can have an incredibly dulling effect on your user adoption campaign. So, and unfortunately, naysayers tend to have a very strong impact on those of us who are enthusiastic about SharePoint and who really want to drive user adoption. We really fear naysayers because they can tarnish SharePoint's image. They can block use of SharePoint in key business units simply by obstinately refusing to adopt the platform or by saying negative things about it to other people. And they also sometimes can even make us question whether we're right, whether user adoption is an achievable goal, or even sometimes whether the platform that we all know and love is worth the effort to try and drive adoption. The greatest threat, though, that naysayers bring is the effect that they really have on us, and by us I mean our SharePoint enthusiasts. When we get intimidated by naysayers and start wringing our hands, I too often see people give away their power. And when we spend hours and hours of time trying to build out collaboration features to make naysayers happy, we bear a huge opportunity cost when we could be working to convert new ninjas to SharePoint and get new people excited about the platform. And instead of doing that, we're spending all of our time trying to get a naysayer to change their minds about the platform. And I always like to stop and tell a story about me circa 2007 when I was rolling out SharePoint within a business unit of a company that I was in, and I ran into somebody who was a big naysayer, just a Microsoft hater, did not like the platforms at all, was never going to like the platforms. And I felt compelled to build a solution so compelling that this naysayer would change their mind and immediately say, nope, Sarah, you were absolutely right, and Microsoft is a great platform. And so I literally, without even getting them on board with the fact that I was going to build them something, I set out to start building a solution that was going to knock their socks off. And I put all kinds of time and effort into it for a couple of weeks, and then I set up a meeting and I showed it to them without any preamble or warning, and of course, they shot it down. And they said, yes, but it can't do this and this and this. So then I went back and spent another couple of weeks trying to make it do all of those extra things that they wanted, brought it back to them again, and guess what? They still weren't happy. They still had other requirements. And I ended up wasting several months trying to convert this naysayer rather than just saying that, you know what, the most important thing I need to do is just trying to stop contorting myself in SharePoint to meet their objective, and to really focus on the users that want to adopt SharePoint, to focus my attention on the users that have a business challenge that I can solve with the platform, instead of trying to chase after the people that are working so hard to deflect what I'm trying to sell. So this is really about go out and try and sow your user adoption seeds in the fields where it has a chance to grow, not where it doesn't. Now, sometimes people come up and say to me, but Sarah, the naysayers are positioned in our company in such a way that I can't simply ignore them or move around them. And sometimes that's true. If your naysayers are at the executive level, or if your naysayers are positioned in such a way that they're really putting your entire SharePoint or Office 365 program at risk, then you need to take another tack entirely. Usually, if that's the case, what I recommend is, again, finding enthusiasts or people who are open to SharePoint, building solutions for them, and then enabling or inspiring them to become champions of the platform and literally work around the naysayers by converting other people for them, other key influencers around them, so that eventually those naysayers are either going to be drowned out by executive teams that have great things to say about SharePoint because it's really helping them meet their business needs, or that the naysayers are just going to sooner or later find that it's not worth the effort to stick their neck out to say negative things about the platform. So either way, trying to convert a naysayer into an enthusiast rarely ever works based on all of the history that I've seen. So I would encourage you to take another approach rather than taking that head-on battle to just trying to win over those naysayers. All right, so that's change agent number one, the law of the few. Change agent number two is the power of context. And people and organizations are creatures of habit. We need to realize that changing habits is much harder than changing structures or changing systems or implementing SharePoint. We also need to acknowledge that teams and organizations have these unique personalities of their own. So if we ignore or we fail to effectively deal with the team and the organizational personality that we have, it could really kill our efforts for trying to drive user adoption. And this next slide really shows an incredible graphic that outlines this, and this is called the Jaws of Culture. I love it. It's from Sen Delaney, and it really highlights the fact that most companies have many initiatives that begin throughout the year, and many in, but few actually come out, and the ones that do tend to deliver on lower results, and they get chewed up by the jaws of culture in between due to things like bureaucracy, hierarchy, turf issues, a lack of alignment, a lack of cultural openness, and trust for that new initiative. So this is really not about SharePoint. This is about your organization, and that you really need to take a look at your organization, what initiatives have been successful in driving change and adoption in the last year or two in your organization. Pick them apart a little bit and determine why were they successful, how were they successful, how can I apply that to my SharePoint campaign. Similarly, I also like to look at those initiatives that I thought should be successful and were not, and why were they not? So that way we can try and learn from that and not have the same unfortunate effect. Okay, so there we go. So when you can understand clearly your organization's cultural barriers, you have a much higher capability to achieve the full potential of your user adoption program. So we first need to understand the cultural definitions behind our company, the personality of our organization, and how people adapt to change. But then we also have to take a look at which of our cast of characters can really help us overcome cultural challenges in our organization. Who's going to be key to helping us really fight that jaws of culture concept and help us to be able to push SharePoint through? And the answer to that, of course, is our SharePoint enthusiasts. They're really going to be your SharePoint groupies, for lack of a better term, that will really help push that SharePoint adoption through the jaws of culture and be able to drive engagement across your company. But in order to do that, enthusiasts need a high amount of positivity. They need to feel that sense of positivity and that sense of encouragement on an ongoing basis in order to stay enthusiastic about the platform. Enthusiasts are going to be your happiness makers when it comes to SharePoint, but they have to feel supported and they have to have a sense of community to be able to help them keep on going and keep on pulling new people in. So I want to talk really quickly, this isn't a community building session, but I want to talk quickly about the need to have and build an internal community in your organization to support your user adoption efforts. That power of community is going to give your enthusiasts and really all the members of the community a sense of belonging, a source of motivation to continue fighting the good fight and pushing for SharePoint. Going to give new ideas and fresh perspectives, new ideas on SharePoint features, new ideas on types of solutions that could be built. It's also going to give people a safe place to talk, to experiment, and to really to live out the SharePoint mantra for your organization. And then, of course, it also provides access to mentors, which are going to be your ninjas. It also provides access to tumblers, who are going to be your excitement drivers. So if I'm going to talk about a community, I have to, at a very high level, talk to you about things that you can do in your company to be able to power a community. First and foremost, you need to be able to find and nurture followers for your community, because you're not going to have a community if you don't have a consistent pipeline of people coming in that are going to be engaged in that community and moving things forward. So make sure that you're welcoming to new people as they join your community. Make it about them, not about you. And it's really more about that the community wins, not necessarily the people leading the community. You want to also build a structure for engagement. Think of it as almost like a community rewards program. It tells people how to become a part of your community and where they belong in that community. And that could be many different things. I've built many internal communities, and some people are really driven to just be a participant and to be an audience member in your community. Make that easy for them. Make them fit in very well doing that. You're going to have other people who are naturally tumblers, who want to be at the center of the action, who want to be engaged. Build a way for them to be able to get engaged. You're going to have other people who are your ninjas that maybe want to be able to say, give them the ability to be a community blogger in your organization and give them the ability to share what they know with others, because they're driven by that need to share what they know. You want to provide new content in your community, and you want to do it often. One of the things that I always recommend is building a community hub or a community home in your organization. Of course, I always like to build it on a SharePoint site, but in order to make that community hub compelling, you have to have new content that people are going to be coming back and looking at day after day after day. So it's very important to provide that new content on a continual basis, even if it's just a tip of the week, a tip of the day, an update of calendar items on new internal training events or community training events like a SharePoint Saturday, but provide that new content. Next, we want to make sure that we acknowledge. This is the giving away the power. The community is never about me or anyone else who's kind of shepherding or leading that community. The power is in the people who are part of that community. So we want to acknowledge everyone else's efforts, and we want to discount our own, and that will really drive your community forward. You want to, of course, listen to your users, what they need, what they want, what they don't understand, and you want to gauge your community to be able to support those efforts. And then really kind of the summary of everything is giving away the power, working yourself out of a role. If you have people who come up through your community and want to start becoming leaders of your community, the best possible way for your community to succeed and the best reflection of you as a community leader is to have somebody else replace you as a community leader, and you become the community leader emeritus. That would be a fantastic outcome for having an internal community. All right, so we've talked about how we can engage our Tumblers to be our connectors. We've talked about how we can use ninjas to educate others, and we've talked about how not to get distracted by naysayers. And we've talked about enthusiasts and how to support them with the community. So I want to circle back around and talk about the last of our two characters again. So we're going to talk about stragglers and cowboys for just a minute. And I want to start with the stragglers. So remember, the stragglers are your traditional users, the laggards that need a strong reason to consider making any kind of a change. They approach innovation with a high degree of skepticism, at times almost seeming to have an aversion to change or to adopting a new platform. So we need to approach stragglers with careful planning and appropriately set expectations for how we want them to engage. If we have too high an expectation that we're going to turn a straggler into an enthusiast, or certainly a straggler into a ninja, that is going to be a very long-term process. So I think it's always best out of the gate to set baby steps for our stragglers and to really make sure that we're being critical in our thinking about what we want to engage the stragglers to do, so that way we can actually drive them to be successful. So we could not expect a straggler with no SharePoint knowledge to come in and want to learn how to build a workflow, for example. That's going to be way too hard. We need to settle for an easy win. For example, teaching them how to go in and upload and tag a document might be a huge win for a straggler, and that might take you quite a while. If you have a department with a few stragglers in it, it might take you a few months to get them comfortable with uploading and tagging documents. So just make sure that you're picking off a scope that can be met when you're dealing with your stragglers. One of the ways that I love to engage my stragglers is using gamification capabilities. Now, gamification is a huge buzzword, but ultimately it's really about applying gaming principles and mechanics to non-gaming environments in order to try and motivate people and drive user behavior. That's what gamification is really aimed at. It can be used to solve problems, to drive engagement, in our case of stragglers, or to direct user behavior. And again, that's what we're really looking to do. Now, gamification can look like a lot of different things. One of the key things that I think most people can relate to is airline miles. I do not have status on my preferred airline right now, but boy, I would love to have it. So how does my airline brand that I like get me to want to engage with them and get status? It's all gamification, right? They have certain rewards that I'm going to get if I spend more money and I fly more with them, and I want to be engaged with that. They've turned it into almost a game of sorts, that if I keep on trying a little harder, I can get a little more in terms of those benefits. That's really that idea behind gamification. So when it comes to your stragglers, one of the most fun gamification strategies that I always ask people to go and check out is a website called thefuntheory.com. And thefuntheory.com was an initiative that Volkswagen put out years ago, and it was really trying to get people to come up with creatively simple ways to get people to do things different. And it's a series of, if you go out to the website, you're going to see a series of short videos. They're less than a minute long, and it's really about trying to get people to do something different. So one of the videos is putting sound effects into a trash can to try and encourage people to throw their trash away rather than litter. Another one is turning a set of stairs that is out in a public transit area, making a set of stairs into something that actually plays music to get people to take the stairs rather than using the escalator that's right next to the stairway. So again, a relatively simple change that we want people to make, and coming up with fun ideas for how to engage those users. This is exactly something that would apply to if you needed to get a straggler to learn how to upload a document and tag it in SharePoint. If you could come up with a gamification strategy similar to the fun theory that makes it comfortable for them, gives them a little bit of positive reinforcement. The funtheory.com, all of the little tricks and ideas that they have out there are not going to help you build they're short term. But that's all you really need for a straggler to get them used to doing something, right? It's just being able to set up a brand new paradigm and make people feel comfortable with doing something different. So I'd recommend checking out thefuntheory.com. All right, so we've talked about gamification as a motivational strategy. Next thing I want to talk about is this idea of mastery. There's a gentleman by the name of Daniel Pink who wrote an amazing book called Drive. And that book outlines some really surprising things about what does and does not motivate people. Think about carrot and stick is something that people think motivates people, and Daniel Pink really debunks that theory. What he says is that a need to master things is what really drives many of us today. And he has an amazing section in this book that talks about why money is not the excellent motivator that many people think it is. If I started to pay my kids $2 a day to be able to make their beds. On the first day, they'd make their bed because they get $2. By the 10th day, they'd need reminding twice to make their bed. And by the third month, they would have even forgotten that the $2 that they get every day is related to them making their bed. And so Daniel Pink really debunks this idea that money is not necessarily a motivator unless there's a critical lack of it in order to sustain life, assuming that that's not the case for your users, and more money might not motivate them to use SharePoint. But if we can tap into this idea of mastery, that might do it. And the whole idea behind mastery, this entire graph that I have up on this chart, I call it the Angry Birds graph. So if we look at Angry Birds, you can take someone like my 10-year-old son and my mother, who both like to play Angry Birds together. Why? Because there's an incentive that you need to try and win the level and get the 3 stars. Then there's a challenge because it's not easy to get the birds to actually take out the structures, right? Then there's an achievement and a reward. If you manage to get the 3 stars, you clear that level, and then you get to level up to another level. And if you're beating grandma or you're beating your grandson, that's an extra achievement and reward, right? And then that feedback loop goes into, I want to keep on going with this again and again and again. And it's driving this feedback loop of incentive, challenge, achievement, and feedback really is what drives us to move from a desire to be able to learn something to a drive, an internal intrinsic motivation to want to master that something. And if we tie this desire to master things back to our set of characters, the character that's going to be most impacted by that is, of course, going to be our cowboys. Our cowboys are driven by a burning need to master all the domains that they enter. They give and get respect based on mastery and technical competency. That motivation to master things is really going to help you understand your cowboys and how to relate to them. So a couple things that I always talk about, and I coach people about handling the cowboys in your organization as it relates to SharePoint. First and foremost, I always treat my cowboys like the superstars that they are. So they know that they're superstars. They wouldn't believe me if I disagreed with them. So I always agree that they are superstars. Remember that superstars don't really like no words. So I try and use words that are not no, you can't do that. I instead say, well, have you thought about doing this? Or wouldn't it be a challenge to do it this way instead? If you lay a challenge in front of them as opposed to giving them a no word, you cannot do it that way, you're going to be able to drive a lot more success and may even be able to find out some new things about how the tools work. I also like to give my cowboys a growth ladder based on technical merit and mastery. I love pairing them up with one another. I love challenging them to go out and continue learning the tool set and making sure that they can see how they compare in terms of technical skills to some of the other cowboys in the organization. I like to reward them. So I often will run user group sessions where I will bring in cowboys and ask them to provide tips and tricks on how to do things with the tools that maybe no one else has ever considered. I do ask them to sit down with me or send me the tips and tricks ahead of time, so that way I can pre-bake them, because we want to make sure that none of those tips and tricks are going to go against best practices or ideas for what we need. But oftentimes Cowboys like to come in and be able to show that they know what they're talking about and that they've discovered some great new whiz-bang feature that nobody ever knew before. So being able to engage them with that is really going to drive positivity with those Cowboys. But the most effective way to be able to handle Cowboys, if they really are just writing roughshod over your best practices, is to pair them up with an agile development partner. So when I think about agile development and those development pairs that many companies have where they'll pair two developers up together, I love to pair a Cowboy with a Ninja. And when you pair a Cowboy with a Ninja, you get some interesting byproducts. That Cowboy is going to teach the Ninja things that the Ninja probably didn't know about the technical tool sets. And that Ninja is going to be able to influence the Cowboy in terms of best practices and to help push them to be able to consider a different path than they might have otherwise been thinking. Now, the key thing to think about there is that you have to make sure that if you're going to pair a Cowboy and a Ninja, that Ninja is at least as technically adept as the Cowboy. If the Cowboy gets a sense, even for a moment, that Ninja cannot keep up with them technically, Cowboy's going to leave them in the dust, and then you're not going to have that true development pairing. Now, sometimes I have enough internal Ninjas to be able to pair them with some of these critical Cowboys. If I don't, I've also gone out and hired consultants to be able to serve in that Ninja capacity. I just always want to make sure that I'm honest with my Ninjas about what I'm expecting and hoping from them when I'm going to pair them up with a Cowboy for that. All right, so I know we're going to go to Q&A within about 10 minutes. Asif, I do want to pause because I did see some questions come in. Are there any, I think I could take maybe one question right now, if there are any that you think are critical. It doesn't sound like it. All right, let's go ahead and keep on going then. So before we move to the general Q&A portion of the session, I do want to go through and talk about a couple of real-life user adoption tactics. These are things that I've implemented before at different companies, give you a taste for just some great user adoption ideas at large. So the first one is hosting a SharePoint hackathon in your organization or frankly for your user group. So I've done this before several times, always an incredible educational opportunity. We tended to run it where we would have teams of volunteers that we would build to make sure that they all are of similar capability levels. And we would give all of the teams the same challenge. So we would give them a business objective and a site collection, and we'd give them about a day to go out and basically build a solution to meet that objective. I think the last time that I ran one of these, the objective was build a project site template for the PMO in our organization. And they had a day to go and build a site template, and then you basically bring all of the teams together in a user group meeting the next day, and every team that you had for the hackathon goes through and does a demo of what they built, the decisions that they made and why they built it, and all the members of your user group audience can see the solutions that were built. In many cases, this has multiple layers of wins. It's a great educational opportunity for everyone who participates in the hackathon. It's a great learning ability for them to not only be able to visualize solutions, but to be able to actually build something and bring it through and show it and demo it. And then you have whatever the objective or the case study, in this case, a project site for a PMO, project site template, you get several examples of that then you can take from to actually be able to help you go out and actually build a project site template for your PMO in your organization. So a great event. If any of you are interested, we can definitely talk offline about that. Would highly recommend doing it. It's also a very inexpensive user adoption campaign item that you can run in your company. And then as promised, I said I would talk a little bit about the SharePoint Ninja program. So for those of you that haven't heard of it yet, this program was built back in 2013, I believe. In the URL that's up on the screen, there is a video, a 75-minute video from the 2014 SharePoint conference where we presented on this entire SharePoint Ninja program. The URL is there, so if you want to go and watch the entire 75-minute session all about SharePoint Ninjas, you are more than welcome to go out there and view that at any point in time. But just to give you some highlights of the program in a few minutes, It was an HR recognition program, so officially sponsored by HR and IT leadership. And SharePoint Ninja, the purpose of a SharePoint Ninja was somebody who built effective SharePoint solutions and sites, that they were natural evangelists for the tool set and for collaboration in the organization. Of course, they're ninjas, so they're willing to teach other people what they know rather than hoarding it for themselves. Most importantly are the last two. The ninjas supported our enterprise vision and our governance, but the goal was also for them to remain embedded on their business teams where they were. We wanted them to be local evangelists for the platforms. The goal was not to start bringing all of these ninjas in to work in the IT department for the SharePoint team. The goal was to be able to have emissaries out there in the organization who would be great evangelists for the platform. We had 4 different levels of our ninjas. Sapphire is level 1 ninja, level 2 was Emerald, level 3 was Ruby, and level 4 Shadow Eye. Why did we have levels? Because we wanted to give them a program for growth. It's one thing to name someone or to recognize them as being a SharePoint Ninja, but then once they make that status, do they stop growing or do we want them to stop growing? By giving them 4 different layers and an opportunity for growth, we were able to engage many of those ninjas over the long term to continue giving back to our internal community and to continue learning more about the platform and the system to be able to grow their knowledge and to be able to do more good. Now, some of our ninjas only really wanted to get that initial ninja recognition, and they were perfectly happy being Sapphire or baby ninjas, as we called them, but others were driven to want to go through the ranks and become that Shadow Eye ninja. And so there were different levels of rewards that went with being at your different ninja levels, and we supported people by assigning them ninja mentors to help them as they worked their way through the levels. So people always ask me, how did people get to be ninjas? And I always say you couldn't apply to be a ninja because it was a recognition program, but you could submit a form so that we would consider you to be recognized as a ninja. And there were 2 key things for consideration to be a ninja. The first one is that you had to have what we called specialization areas in SharePoint. And this is really showing feature and technical mastery of the platform. So what we did, we got in a room with a giant whiteboard and we started listing out all of the different SharePoint feature sets that we could think of. Permissions, web parts, document libraries, lists, info path forms, out-of-the-box workflows, SharePoint designer workflows. You can see where this is going. We came up with a list of about 45 different features that you can master within SharePoint. In order to be considered for a level 1 Sapphire Ninja, you had to have mastery of at least 5 features. It doesn't matter what 5 features they were, but you had to have mastery of at least 5 features. And what do we mean by mastery? Mastery means that you could take someone cold off the street who has never heard of SharePoint and teach them that feature and help them to be productive in it, which is a pretty high bar. So we're not talking about you once heard Sarah give a presentation on content types and now you've mastered it. You have to know content types well enough to teach it cold to someone else. That's really the goal of these specialization areas. So a level 1 ninja had to have 5 specialization areas. A level 2 ninja had to have 10. A level 3 ninja had to have 15. And a Shadow Eye ninja, which is our level 4, had to have 16 or more feature areas of SharePoint that they technically had mastered. Then the second layer is really this layer of community engagement. You could become a level 1 Sapphire Ninja just based on mastering 5 areas of specialization. But if you wanted to get promoted to a level 2, a level 3, or a level 4 Ninja, you also had to be involved in our internal SharePoint community in some way. You could lead a hackathon team. You could write SharePoint blog posts. You could staff open office hours when we would have people come in and ask questions on a walk-in help basis for SharePoint. You could present at a user group meeting. You could do one of 50 different things to help support the community. But if you weren't engaged in helping to support that internal community, you could not be promoted past a level 1 ninja. This was really key for us because it really made the community, it made the ninjas a part of the community and a driver of the community. So it wasn't just my team, the enterprise SharePoint team, driving that community forward. We had a battalion of ninjas to help us. We launched this program in 2013, and we were hoping to have 15 ninjas within the first 2 years. We were amazed at the results. I believe we had 24 ninjas in less than 12 months. And they made all the difference in our ability to drive that tipping point and really to get that early majority of people engaged with SharePoint and adopting the platform. So when it comes to SharePoint Ninjas, of course, you need to consider what kind of rewards that you want to give them for their efforts. So these are a huge list of rewards. Some of them are things that I've done before at different companies that I've worked at. Some of them are ideas that I've gotten as I talk to other companies and other organizations who have similar types of programs. The only two that I really want to talk about, actually three that I really want to talk about is we gave all of our ninjas a water cooler cup that was labeled SharePoint Ninja on it to use at work. And that ended up being, it didn't cost us a lot, but it ended up being a very coveted item of swag, and it was free SharePoint advertising as people would go around to meetings and they'd carry their water with them throughout the day. And suddenly we found that everyone seemed to know what a SharePoint Ninja was, even if they didn't use SharePoint. So it was great advertising. So that worked really well for us. Another thing that we did that worked really well was updating people's Active Directory names to say SharePoint Ninja. And we did this because I sat right next to the Active Directory people. And so one day I asked them, I said, is there a way that I could add a tagline to my name in Active Directory to call out that I am Sarah Haase -SharePoint Ninja? And they said, yeah, we could do that. That'd be easy. And so they made the change, and suddenly every time people got an email from me, inside or outside my company, my name showed up as Sarah Haase SharePoint Ninja. And people thought that was cool. And then they wanted to know more about SharePoint and what a SharePoint Ninja was. And that Active Directory name didn't cost us any money, but it motivated quite a few people to want to become SharePoint Ninjas so that they could have that title after their name. And it drove a lot of conversations about the platform. And then the third one that I wanted to highlight, again, didn't cost any money, is that one of the perks of being a SharePoint Ninja is that at the end of the year when it came to annual reviews, if you were a SharePoint Ninja, SharePoint team lead, agreed that I would submit feedback for your annual review to your leaders. So you could request 360-degree feedback and I would submit it based on you being a ninja and talk about what you've been doing to evangelize the platform and be a good community member. I wasn't sure how often that would be leveraged, but I found myself writing an awful lot of 360-degree reviews. About 90% of our ninjas leveraged that annual review input, and it cost me some time, but it didn't cost us any money to be able to build that in. So with that, I'm really going to bring it kind of full circle back to this cast of characters that we've talked about. So we've talked about threaded throughout the webinar today. We've talked about the naysayers, the enthusiasts, the cowboy, your straggler, your tumbler, and your ninja, how you can engage them, how you can redirect them, or in some cases, how you can stop losing time working with them and focus where you need to in order to be able to drive your success forward. So with that, Asif, we have 15 minutes left to cover questions.
Wonderful. Well, I don't know if you can see the questions yourself. Would you like me to read them?
I can. Let me see if I can. All right. So the first one that I see is, what if someone in management is a naysayer or a straggler? It's difficult to support SharePoint and train others if their manager isn't using it. That happens all the time. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have a naysayer that is your manager, let's say, and isn't a supporter of using SharePoint, frankly, I take a look at some of the pain points that your manager is facing in terms of business systems or collaboration needs or process optimization challenges that they have. And I'd be looking at, what could I build within SharePoint to be able to optimize that? And don't make it about SharePoint, make it about whatever the solution is that you're trying to deliver for that manager. And sooner or later, if you can highlight and target something that is a business pain point for that person that is enough to drive them absolutely out of their minds crazy, and you can improve it using SharePoint, that is usually going to get you at least a tiny foot in the door to be able to have them start leveraging it. If that doesn't do it, then I would look for a business pain point that hits other people in your department. If you can convince them to use SharePoint, then it's not you trying to convince your boss it has value. You're going to then have other people who are going to be your walking, talking advertisements that sooner or later is either going to impact your boss, as I mentioned earlier, to either stop saying negative things or to be somewhat quieter about it because they can't suddenly argue with everyone else who likes SharePoint. So one way or the other, you need to find a way to be able to sidestep or work around the naysayer by attacking the business problem or by engaging others to become champions and supporters rather than dealing with those naysayers directly and spinning. So the next question that I saw out here is, so what do you do with naysayers? Ignore them. I love ignoring them entirely. And the reason why I love to ignore them entirely is because if I focused all of my time and energy on working with the people who are open to adopting SharePoint, I could be successful for the rest of my life and never have a lack of work to do. When I was first starting out working with SharePoint back in 2007, and I was building SharePoint solutions, I ended up building 2 or 3 projects of SharePoint solutions for people. Within 6 months, I had a 2-year-long waiting list of people who were waiting for me to build solutions for them. And that's all people who were enthusiastic about the platform, who were open to it. So if with a little bit of effort and choosing some key projects, you can build an incredible pipeline of people who want your solutions. So spending time with the naysayers prevents you from being able to go out and engage with those users that you really need to, where you can move the ball forward. So absolutely, if you have the ability to ignore the naysayers altogether and just focus on those people that are open to SharePoint, 100% do that. If your naysayers are in such a position where you can't ignore them entirely, then that goes to my previous answer about working around them. So Asif, I'm having a little bit of trouble. Are those the only 2 questions in here? My view is a little view here.
Yeah, no, let me go ahead and read one. Graham mentioned, how do you automate indicators for gamification milestones?
How do I automate indicators? It's interesting. So I think it depends on what kind of a gamification strategy that you would have and what kind of indicators that you would want. Obviously, when I talked about the SharePoint Ninja program, one of the things that that was a user adoption campaign that was highly gamified in the sense that we gave them colors, we gave them names, they had special swag, they had special perks that went with that. If you looked at our ninjas online in our SharePoint environment, they would have their different colors or their different swags that would follow them around. So part of that answer really depends on what types of user adoption programs you're implementing, but I would recommend it, particularly if you're running any kind of a recognition program, that you highlight that for your users.
Great. Graham also mentioned, as a continuation, I guess, that what do you use? Do you use number of blogs posted, number of documents uploaded to SharePoint?
So when we were promoting ninjas past a level 1 ninja to a level 2, a level 3, and a level 4, it wasn't so much that we looked at the quantity of their engagement in the community, or it was more that we looked at, were they engaged in the community? So in order to get from a level 1 ninja to a level 2 ninja, you had to have 5 additional areas of mastery, and you had to have a proven track record of being involved in the community. That doesn't mean that you had to write up 6 articles or go to 7 open labs or speak at 2 user group meetings. It was more, are you engaged and do you give back? And most of the time that was yes, they give back, or no, they don't give back. And if we don't feel like they're giving back enough and they want to be a level 2 ninja, sounds like an opportunity to have coffee and sit down and talk about it, right? What are you looking to get out of this ninja program? If you say that you want to move up, I don't see you really engaged within the community, and we would need you to become more engaged in order to be able to move that dial.
I see a few notices saying that, hey, great stuff, good information. So that's coming from Jennifer, from Ricardo, from others as well. Great job, Sarah.
Okay.
Here's a question from Cheryl. Help me differentiate the enthusiast and the Tumbler. They seem very similar.
And they might be. So oftentimes I think most of our Tumblers are enthusiastic about SharePoint and the platform. The difference is personality type. So you could have someone who's very enthusiastic about SharePoint, that's an enthusiast, but are they people that are going to be well-connected, gregarious, friendly, able to pull other people in to the SharePoint community? That's more of a personality trait or characteristic. So I think of Tumblers as being those people that get up in front of a crowd and they're like the life of the party, right? Not all of our SharePoint enthusiasts are going to have that kind of personal affect, especially when it comes to talking with other users. So that's really the point where the Tumblers and the enthusiasts differ. I think oftentimes a Tumbler is an enthusiast, but not all enthusiasts are Tumblers.
Okay, makes sense. I have a couple of questions that sound very similar. One from Chris, the other one from Daniel, asking what specific incentives would you give, for example, to the participants of Hackathon and for winners and for other
Mhm.
things? Are there specific incentives you can think of?
So, well, it depends on your budget. So we had a low budget when we were running our hackathon. I managed to buy pizza and donuts, and I felt pretty good about that. So I think that the first one, we gave away little plastic trophies filled with candy. So they were a relatively nominal purchase. By the time the next hackathon came around, I don't think I had budget for plastic trophies and candy. So we printed them certificates and ultimate bragging rights versus all the other teams. And the bragging rights seem to be the better prize than the candy and the trophies. So people always love being able to brag that their team won. And at some companies, right, especially if you're working sometimes for a government agency, you might not be able to give them anything because there might be a tax implication. So it's important to ask the question of whether or not you can even engage with them that way. Bragging rights are free.
Sure are. I know somebody asked before about the management, somebody in management being naysayers. Now, here's another question from Holly saying, what if IT themselves are the naysayers? How do you get around that?
That happens at a lot of different organizations where IT is the naysayers themselves. So the key question then becomes, do you even have the capability of moving to SharePoint and Office 365? If your IT is blocking it entirely, then that's kind of a different session, right? So then we're talking about building a business case to be able to engage your company and move them to that platform. If you already have SharePoint and Office 365 and your IT department is not being helpful in that regard, I found myself in that position before, and unfortunately that takes a lot of bottoms up and top down work in terms of trying to build a business case that your leadership is going to find compelling to try and engage that IT team, but also working with that IT team from a bottom up perspective to really try and see if you can influence them to see the vision and the positive utilization of the tools, and then can be really clear with them about what you want to achieve. So some of that is going to be very specific to the construct of the organization itself.
Okay. Jennifer's asking, at the beginning of the project, it seems that most members of management don't know what they don't know about SharePoint functionality. So what is your approach to show or teach them without overwhelming them?
So I never teach executives about the functionality behind SharePoint. I far prefer to show them case study overviews. This goes back to the ROI piece that I talked about at the very beginning when I introduced myself. One of the things that I love to do is after I build a SharePoint solution, put together an ROI case study summary of what we did. And the ROI case study summary, I always build it in PowerPoint because executives love PowerPoint at everywhere that I've ever been. And I make it one slide, and it outlines the business need, the solution that was built, and the benefits. And it's not really about SharePoint. It's about the business need of what the business need or the pain point was, what solution did we build, and what benefits does it achieve. And I love amassing a bunch of those case studies together into a portfolio of solutions that have been built, and then take that to those executives, and I will always talk to them about, here's the business needs that we've managed to fulfill successfully with SharePoint, and here is the benefits that we're seeing. That is by far better than teaching them about feature functionality of SharePoint because they don't get it. They won't be able to necessarily translate. Many people can't translate between what is a list and what is a workflow, and how on earth is that going to help me meet a business objective. If you start out talking about a business need, then they can get that, right? They can get that because that's something real, it's something tangible for them. And then you focus on the benefits of SharePoint.
Great, agree. Getting another couple of people saying good job, Sarah. So Martha and Jamie saying great job. And then a question from Martha here saying that what if the naysayers say it's too time consuming to assign properties? She's talking about that specific case over here.
Too time consuming to assign properties?
Yeah, I'm thinking it's document properties that Martha has mentioned.
Document metadata?
Most probably, yep.
Yeah, most of us have been through that before where we need some kind of metadata on our documents and it's too time consuming to be able to go and build it. So Martha, that's where I like to get creative and take a look at how I can automate the assignment of that metadata. One of the things that I've done in the past, and I think I've got a blog post on this somewhere if you want to go looking through my blog, but I think I've before created, yeah, I'm sure I've blogged about it. Go out to a site, and if I have, let's say, 4 or 5 different types of documents that could be uploaded, I'll actually create an upload button on the main page of my site for each of those document types, and I use content types in the back end to be able to auto tag those documents based on whichever button that they clicked on to upload. So every upload button will take you to upload a document at the same document library, but it's going to automate the assignment of metadata. So you can always look at solutions like that as an alternative if you just don't think it's possible that your users will tag things.